In the smoke and chaos of the American Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant carved out a reputation that struck terror into the hearts of Confederate commanders across the South. He was the bulldog general who refused to let go once he sank his teeth in, the commander who absorbed horrific losses and still kept marching forward, grinding down every opponent through sheer determination and overwhelming force. But there was one name that consistently cut through his iron composure, one Confederate officer whose mere presence on the battlefield or in the dispatches forced Grant to pause, to reroute columns, to reinforce vulnerable supply lines, and to acknowledge privately that this man operated on an entirely different level. That man was Nathan Bedford Forrest. Grant never stood before reporters or wrote in official reports that he feared any Confederate. That wasn't his style. He was stoic, practical, and focused always on the end game. Yet those who lived and worked beside him day after day saw the subtle changes. Sylvanus Cadwallader, the sharp-eyed journalist who shadowed Grant through the Western campaigns for years, captured it clearly in his private writings. Forrest, he said, was the only Confederate cavalry leader of whom Grant stood in genuine dread. This wasn't romantic legend spun around campfires. It grew from bitter experience, lightning raids that ripped apart carefully laid supply networks, victories pulled from situations that looked hopeless on paper, and a style of fighting that ignored every conventional rule of engagement taught in military academies. Forrest made war feel chaotic and deeply personal, and that unsettled even the man who would eventually become the Union's general-in-chief. Nathan Bedford Forrest came into the world on July 13, 1821, in a modest log cabin set among the rolling hills outside Chapel Hill, Tennessee. He was the first of 12 children born to a family that scratched out a living on poor soil and sheer willpower. Life was unforgiving from the start. When his father passed away in 1837 after a sudden fever, the 16-year-old Bedford instantly stepped into the role of provider and protector for his mother and younger siblings. He worked the family farm with his bare hands, then headed west into Mississippi looking for better opportunities. There he took any work he could find, driving stagecoaches through dangerous territory, operating a livery stable, trading horses and livestock, speculating on land deals, and eventually building one of the busiest slave trading operations in the Memphis area. By the middle of the 1950s, he had accumulated significant wealth, plantations, warehouses, cotton fields, and a network of business contacts that stretched across the Mississippi River Valley. Physically, he stood 6'2", with broad shoulders, piercing eyes, and a presence that commanded attention. He was quick-tempered and never hesitated to settle disputes with fists, knives, or pistols. In one especially violent street altercation in Memphis, he killed 2 brothers who had ambushed his uncle and successfully claimed self-defense in court. That same fierce instinct for survival, dominance, and decisive action would translate directly onto the battlefields of the Civil War. When Tennessee voted to secede in the spring of 1861, Forrest did not wait for official calls or political appointments. He enlisted immediately as a private in a mounted rifle company. But a man of his resources and drive could not stay at the bottom for long. Using his own money, he purchased horses, saddles, rifles, and equipment for scores of volunteers. By October, he had raised, outfitted, and trained an entire regiment, the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, and received a lieutenant colonel's commission. No one sent him to West Point. No instructor drilled him in grand strategy or formal tactics. He absorbed lessons from practical experience, from studying maps by firelight, from watching how terrain could multiply the effectiveness of a few hundred determined riders, and from understanding that speed, surprise, and raw aggression could overcome superior numbers. His men quickly gave him the nickname the Wizard of the Saddle, and it fit perfectly. He had an almost supernatural ability to appear suddenly behind enemy lines, strike with devastating force, and melt away before organized resistance could form. His first major demonstration came in the grim February days of 1862 at Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. Grant's Union forces had the Confederate garrison tightly boxed in. Senior Southern officers, facing overwhelming odds and low ammunition, decided surrender was the only option. Forrest would have none of it. He assembled as many men as he could, roughly 400 of his own, plus others willing to follow, and led a desperate nighttime breakout through a narrow, lightly guarded gap in the Union lines. They waded through icy waters under fire, but escaped intact. While Grant celebrated the capture of the fort and thousands of prisoners, Forrest was already riding free. Just days afterwards, he dashed into Nashville ahead of the advancing Federals. Working at breakneck speed, he commandeered every available wagon, loaded them with 250,000 pounds of precious bacon, thousands of uniforms, ammunition crates, medical supplies, and 14 heavy cannons, and spirited the entire train south to safety. That single act deprived Grant's advancing army of critical provisions and forced quartermasters to scramble for weeks, slowing the entire Western offensive.
In early 1864, Forrest carried the war into Kentucky, striking Paducah and threatening Union control along the Ohio River. Then came the dark day at Fort Pillow on April 12th. A mixed Union garrison of roughly 550 men, about half of them black soldiers from the United States colored troops, held a strong position on a high bluff overlooking the Mississippi. After a hard night march, Forrest's troopers surrounded the fort. He demanded surrender. When refused, the Confederates attacked. What happened in the final minutes has been argued over for more than a century and a half. Union survivors told of systematic executions, of wounded men shot where they lay, of black soldiers hunted down even after raising white flags. Confederate accounts maintained that some defenders continued firing after signaling surrender, and that the close-quarters fighting descended into uncontrolled chaos. Forrest's official report was brief and matter-of-fact. Grant, reading accounts later, noted in his memoirs that Forrest had conveniently omitted details that would horrify any civilized reader. Northern newspapers erupted in outrage, calling for vengeance. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War branded it a massacre. Whether Forrest explicitly ordered killings or lost control of his enraged men, the outcome was horrific. Hundreds of Union dead, many killed after resistance had clearly ended. The episode stained Forrest's reputation permanently in the North and gave Grant and Sherman additional moral fuel to pursue total victory. Despite the controversy, the raids never stopped. June 10, 1864 brought Forrest's tactical masterpiece at Brice's Crossroads in Mississippi. With only 3,500 men, he confronted 8,000 Federals commanded by Samuel Sturgis. Forrest chose the ground with care, allowed the Union infantry to exhaust themselves on a long, hot march through dusty roads, then unleashed a perfectly timed combination of dismounted rifle fire and cavalry charges. The Federal line disintegrated. Forrest's men captured 16 artillery pieces, 176 wagons, and more than 1,500 prisoners while suffering relatively light casualties. Sturgis's command fled in panic. Sherman, then driving towards Atlanta, was forced to detach significant forces to chase Forrest down. Even from his new headquarters in Virginia, where Grant now oversaw all Union armies, the impact registered. One resourceful Confederate was still pinning down thousands of bluecoats who could have been used on the main fronts. Forrest tasted defeat at Tupelo in July, but bounced back quickly. In August, he executed one of his boldest operations yet, a lightning strike into Memphis itself. His troopers briefly occupied parts of the city, captured Union officers in their beds, and thoroughly embarrassed the garrison before slipping away into the countryside. November saw the spectacular destruction of the enormous Union supply depot at Johnsonville, Tennessee. Using cleverly positioned field artillery, his men sank or damaged numerous gunboats and set fire to millions of dollars worth of food, ammunition, and stores. The night sky glowed orange as shells cooked off in the flames. Once again, Forrest's command vanished before a serious counterattack could organize.
By the closing months of 1864, the Confederacy was bleeding out. Forrest joined John Bell Hood's disastrous invasion of Tennessee. He argued bitterly over tactics before the battles of Franklin and Nashville, then performed heroic work covering the shattered Confederate retreat against overwhelming odds. In February 1865, he received promotion to lieutenant general, the only man on either side to reach that rank without any pre-war formal military education. He made one final stand at Selma, Alabama in April, before surrendering his command on May 9th at Gainesville. In a moving farewell to his men, he urged them to return home peacefully, obey the laws of the reunited country, and work to rebuild the South. The post-war era proved nearly as difficult as the war itself. Forrest's pre-war fortune had evaporated in the chaos. He attempted farming, railroad ventures, and various business enterprises with only limited success. In 1866, he became entangled with a secretive new group forming in Tennessee, the Ku Klux Klan. By 1867, he was serving as its first Grand Wizard, lending his organizational genius and personal prestige to the hooded order. The Klan unleashed a reign of night-riding terror aimed at intimidating black voters, Republican officials, and anyone seen as threatening white Southern dominance. Beatings, lynchings, and arson became tragically common across the Reconstruction South. Forrest testified before Congress in 1871, denying formal membership at that point, while claiming the original Klan had served to protect Southern women and property during a time of lawlessness. He insisted he had helped disband the group in 1869 when its violence spiraled out of control. Scholars still debate exactly how much direct authority he exercised, but there is little doubt that his name provided both legitimacy and widespread fear. In his final years, Forrest offered glimpses of a more complex evolution. He spoke publicly about the need for sectional reconciliation and economic cooperation between North and South. In 1875, he addressed a large gathering of black citizens in Memphis, expressing hopes for peaceful progress. One especially striking moment occurred when he accepted flowers from a black woman, and to the astonishment of onlookers, kissed her on the cheek, a gesture almost unimaginable for a former Confederate general and slave trader. He told interviewers he wanted the two sections of the country to live as brothers once more. Whether these statements represented genuine personal growth, political pragmatism in a changed world, or a mixture of both, they arrived after years of bloodshed and could never fully cleanse the earlier chapters of his life. Diabetes, combined with old war wounds and the accumulated strain of a hard existence, finally claimed him. Nathan Bedford Forrest died quietly at his son's home in Memphis on October 29, 1877, at the age of 56. Thousands lined the streets for his funeral. The city and much of the South mourned a figure many still considered the greatest cavalry leader the war had produced. Grant outlived him by 8 years, passing in 1885. In his widely read personal memoirs, Grant rarely devoted extended passages to individual Confederate opponents. He wrote of Robert E. Lee with professional respect. Yet between the lines, Forrest's influence is unmistakable. The repeated disruptions to supply lines during the Vicksburg campaign, the constant need to protect rear areas, the forced diversions of troops that could have been used elsewhere, these operational headaches were unique in that persistence and effectiveness. Lee could ultimately be worn down by superior numbers and unrelenting pressure applied across multiple fronts. Forrest, however, fought in the shadows and the gaps, using mobility and audacity to make Grant's carefully orchestrated campaigns far more expensive and uncertain than they otherwise would have been. Sherman captured the man's essence when he described Forrest as the most remarkable figure the entire Civil War produced. It was high praise wrapped in deep frustration. Forrest's innovations, employing cavalry as highly mobile infantry, concentrating firepower at the decisive point, living off the land to maintain speed, and using deception as a primary weapon, anticipated many elements of modern mobile warfare. He possessed no formal staff training and had never studied Napoleon or Jomini in a classroom, yet he instinctively understood the value of speed, surprise, and relentless pressure. His troopers worshipped him because he led every charge from the front, slept on the same cold ground, ate the same meager rations, and never asked them to take risks he wouldn't take himself. His Union opponents learned to respect and fear him because he turned every encounter into something intensely personal and tactically creative.
The debate surrounding Forrest's legacy continues to rage today. Monuments bearing his name have been removed from public squares. Military bases and parks have been renamed. Some remember him solely for his battlefield brilliance that repeatedly delayed Union victory in the Western theater. Others see primarily the pre-war slave trader, the commander associated with the horrors at Fort Pillow, and the early leader of the Ku Klux Klan. Both realities belong to the same extraordinarily complex and driven individual who rose from frontier poverty to shape history. What Grant's inner circle understood, and what students of the war still wrestle with, is how one man, operating with limited men and scarce resources, created such consistent trouble for the most determined and ultimately victorious general of the Union effort. The explanation lies in those muddy Tennessee backroads of 1862, in the glowing embers of burned supply trains, in the thundering charges at Brice's Crossroads, and in the quiet strategic adjustments Grant was forced to make time after time. Nathan Bedford Forrest did not simply fight against Ulysses S. Grant. He compelled Grant to confront the uncomfortable truth that complete victory was never guaranteed, no matter how overwhelming the Northern advantages appeared on paper.
In the cold, merciless mathematics of that terrible conflict, that single fact elevated Forrest above every other Confederate commander in the mind of the man who eventually won the war. Forrest's life mirrors the 19th century South in stark, unflinching detail: raw ambition forged in hardship, material success earned through relentless risk and labor, military genius discovered through necessity rather than formal schooling, and a post-war existence shadowed by the powerful forces of change and retribution he had helped set in motion. Grant, the unassuming Midwestern tanner's son who rose through quiet competence, stubborn endurance, and an almost supernatural ability to absorb punishment and keep advancing, met his tactical and temperamental opposite in this fiery, self-made Tennessean who thrived on audacity and improvisation. Even after the guns fell silent at Appomattox, the memory of Forrest's operations continued to influence Union thinking. Officers who had spent months chasing him across Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee carried hard-won lessons into the post-war Indian Wars on the frontier. Cavalry doctrine evolved partly because of what Forrest had proven, that small, highly mobile, and boldly led forces could paralyze much larger armies if they struck at the right vulnerabilities with enough speed and nerve. Grant's own writings and the observations of those around him reveal a commander who valued concrete results far more than flowery rhetoric. He could acknowledge the strategic gifts of men like Lee with cool professionalism, but the persistent practical headaches caused by Forrest stood in a category of their own. Again and again, just as Union forces in the West seemed ready to deliver a knockout blow, Forrest's horsemen would materialize in the rear, severing communications, destroying stockpiles, and forcing costly pauses that consumed weeks and additional lives. Those pauses gave other Confederate commanders time to regroup, reinforce, or launch countermoves. The human toll on both sides defies easy description. Forrest lost 2 brothers in the fighting. He watched beloved officers and thousands of his loyal troopers fall in muddy fields and dusty roads. Grant lost close friends and saw entire armies decimated in campaigns that Forrest's actions helped extend. Yet both men, in their sharply different ways, embodied the contradictions of their era: courage and brutality, fierce loyalty and calculated violence, wholesale destruction paired with the fragile dream of eventual national reunion. Forrest's later halting attempts at reconciliation, however sincere or imperfect they may seem through modern eyes, reflect the painful path many former Confederates tried to navigate in a transformed South. The region he returned to after surrender lay in ruins, occupied by federal troops, and undergoing radical social and political change. His involvement with the Klan took place amid the turbulent early years of Reconstruction, when many white Southerners felt law and order had collapsed, and newly freed black citizens struggled to secure the rights promised by emancipation. The violence that erupted left deep scars that would linger for generations. By the time death came for him in 1877, Forrest had transcended any single battle or raid. To some, he stood as a symbol of unyielding Southern defiance and natural military genius. To others, he represented the darkest impulses of racial control and extra-legal terror. Grant, spending his final years battling cancer while racing to complete his memoirs and provide for his family, rarely dwelled on specific Confederate antagonists in public. Yet the cumulative strategic impact of Forrest's campaigns had left an indelible mark on the general who eventually led the Union to victory. The indirect contest between these two men, one defined by relentless pressure and superior resources, the other by lightning strikes and unbreakable audacity, captures something fundamental about the Civil War. It was never only a clash of great armies or competing political systems, it was also a collision of powerful personalities whose decisions shaped the fate of the Republic. Grant's dogged persistence ultimately prevailed, but Forrest's unpredictability made that victory far bloodier and more prolonged than it might otherwise have been. In the final analysis, Ulysses S. Grant prevailed, just as the Union prevailed, but the deep professional respect, however grudging, that the Union commander held for his most elusive and troublesome foe speaks volumes about the quality of the opposition he faced. Nathan Bedford Forrest forced Grant to experience something close to genuine military anxiety, not through panic, but through the sober recognition of a threat that could not be easily brushed aside or neutralized by numbers alone. That rare achievement, earned amid 4 years of unprecedented industrial-scale slaughter, secures Forrest a permanent and deeply controversial place in the military history of the United States.